Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Today, we return with another question and answer session that aims at a fundamental question underlying spiritual life. What is the purpose of the human form of life? Now, when we're seeking answers to life's existential questions, it's helpful to turn to the spiritual wisdom texts, such as the Bhagavad-gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, as the origin of these texts is divine. The Supreme Lord Himself is their source, and thus we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by hearing the advice provided in these texts. And I think you'll find the answers given therein quite compelling. All Vedic literature is summarized in what is known as the Vedanta-sutra. And the beginning of the Vedanta-sutra, the very first aphorism states, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, which translates to, now is the time to inquire into the absolute truth. In other words, now that we have this human form of life, now is the time to inquire into spiritual topics, into the nature of the self, and into the nature of the absolute truth from whom all things emanate. This is the purpose of the human form of life. This call to action that we find at the beginning of the Vedanta-sutra prompts us to not make the mistake of leading a life devoid of spiritual investigation. Rather, we are encouraged to accept the invitation, the unique opportunity that this human form affords us to explore the nature of spirit, the essence of life itself. The Bhagavad-gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam both urge us to begin fulfilling the purpose of the human form of life as soon as we possibly can. In the Gita, Arjuna grapples with life's meaning, even wondering what the value of winning the battle is if practically his whole family will be killed in this battle of Kurukshetra. Of course, he is reminded while discussing with Krishna that no one actually dies. Everyone is actually the eternal spirit soul, or jiva. And he realizes that acting in devotional service, or bhakti yoga, to Krishna will give his life meaning, independent of all external factors. Meanwhile, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which we identified last time as the next level of study after the Bhagavad-gita, we encounter the compelling history of a king who learns that he has just 7 days left to live, 7 days left in his current body. Confronted with this news, he poses the intelligent questions: what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of my existence? And how can I ensure that I leave my body in proper spiritual consciousness? And the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, 12 cantos worth, so many volumes, is the answer he receives for what to do with the 7 remaining days that he has. Now, if we're reflective, we'll note that the king's situation is not altogether different from our own. The difference is that he knew he had 7 days left to live in that body, and thus he could arrange for the best possible way to exit his current body in full spiritual consciousness. Whereas we do not know when we will leave our bodies, when our time is up in them. However, by considering the king's questions now, we can make better decisions in the present, inquiring into spiritual life, and in the rest of the time we have leading up to the end of our time in our bodies. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, or Srila Prabhupada, who brought Bhakti Yoga to the West, would often note that the human form of life is different from other forms of life that we encounter, like animal and plant species, etc., precisely because we do have the intelligence in these bodies to inquire into spiritual topics. The birds, the squirrels, and other life forms that we see when we look out our windows are mostly concerned with the basic necessities of life and with survival. They're not asking the deep questions of life, and they're not interested in starting up a spiritual life, right? But the human form gives us the potential to lead a spiritual life. Of course, humans also need to be concerned with survival, to take action to provide for our material bodies and minds, so that we, the soul, remain in our bodies. The human form that we have is like a temple for the soul. We're advised to take care of our bodies so that we may make the best use of our time in them. Our body is actually termed our sadhana sharira, our vehicle for performing our spiritual practices. So the body is an important part of our spiritual life. Therefore, we do take care of our material bodies and we don't neglect them. However, we're not meant to exclusively look after our material bodies. We have to remember that we're the soul situated within these bodies. In this human form of life, we're meant to develop spiritually, even while we take care of our material bodies. And part of taking care of our material bodies means having a home to live in, and a job to maintain our home, and possessions, and a car to get to our job, etc. So we may have temporary goals in our life that we pursue and dovetail in service to Krishna, like finding a new car, or buying a new home, or advancing our career, or something like that. But while we do those things, we're urged to never forget the ultimate goal of this human form of life, which is reviving our relationship with the Supreme. And we are urged to also use those things, our home, our cars, our possessions, in service to Krishna somehow. Then all those temporary goals also become spiritualized. The Srimad Bhagavatam reminds us of the ultimate goal of life in its opening chapter, wherein we hear, "Life's desires should not be directed toward exclusively pleasing our material senses. One should desire only a healthy life or self-preservation, since a human being is meant for inquiry about the absolute truth. Nothing else should be the goal of one's works." While this statement may sound heavy, it's actually in our best interest. We are spiritual beings, so material things cannot ultimately satisfy us. However, if we lead a spiritual life, we will uncover true spiritual happiness, which is lasting and fulfilling. Unlike the material happiness of this world, which is temporary, it comes and goes. Now, keep in mind that it's not that our pursuit of spiritual life will force us to give up everything that we know and hold dear. Recall from our classes on dovetailing that the principle of yukta vairagya, which we learn in Bhakti Yoga, systematically teaches us to connect our lives with the Supreme, from whom everything in this world originates and to whom everything in this world actually belongs. While we do avoid items and activities that lower our consciousness, such as meat eating and consuming intoxicants, most aspects of our lives can be spiritually harmonized. Bhakti Yoga is less giving up and more uncovering the proper use of things in our life in order to utilize them in service to Krishna. Now, on the topic of the human form and its potential, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, one of our prominent bhakti literatures, Srila Prabhupada writes, "The saying that the human form of life is the best position for devotional service has its special significance because only in this form, the human form, can a living entity revive their eternal relationship with the supreme absolute truth. The human form is considered the highest state in the cycle of the species of life in the material world. If one takes advantage of this highest kind of material form, one can regain their position of devotional service to the Lord." So we have the potential to act on our eternal relationship with Krishna in this human form of life that we have. That relationship with the Supreme is already there, eternally existing, but it is dormant until we decide to act on it and make it active. Think of how many life forms there are populating this material planet. If you look out your window again and try to begin to count, you'll be overwhelmed almost immediately. Look at all the blades of grass, the trees, the insects, the birds, the squirrels, the deer, etc. And those are only the ones you can see. There are also bacteria and mites and other life forms we cannot detect with our limited material vision. There are so many living entities on this planet that humans are greatly outnumbered. Thus, the human form of life is rare, and the opportunity to inquire into spiritual topics is therefore also exceedingly rare. Take advantage of this human form of life. Start your spiritual inquiry now. Now that you have this human form of life, now is the time to spiritually inquire, to receive the answers, and to start acting on those answers. Because we are eternal beings, it doesn't matter when we begin our inquiry, but if we begin it once we realize its urgency. Krishna, the Supreme Lord, will reciprocate with us immediately as soon as we turn toward him, and he can make the impossible possible. After all, he's the Supreme. What can't he do? This means that regardless of how much time we have left in these bodies, or how little time, we can achieve all success in spiritual life if we are simply sincere in our spiritual inquiry and sincere in our practice of Bhakti Yoga. It would be a mistake not to act on this knowledge of the human form, or to save it for later in our lives. Srila Prabhupada also often quoted the saying, "Trust no future, however pleasant." We don't know what's going to happen, right? Loitering in this material world is a dangerous gamble. Best we accept the aphorism at the beginning of the Vedanta-sutra, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, that now is the time to inquire into the absolute truth and fulfill the purpose of this human form of life. So that's all we have for today. Please let us know if you have any questions, and in the meantime, we'll be preparing our next video according to your questions and interests. And we'll see you next time on Bhakti Fundamentals.